living in Georgia when Daddy moved down to Florida and met you at Volusia County. My sister, my youngest sister Patty, was still living with Daddy and Mother in Ormond Beach. And he was the correctional officer over there, and then he went to work for a company that made trailers. And that was the last job he had there before he went back to Georgia. So I'm sure he told you a lot of things. And when we get to another part of my program, I'm going to reiterate what you said about him being humble.
Okay.
So,
Well, anything, I now plead the fifth one. Thank you for saying this. Go ahead.
okay, we have a loop of photos up here.
You want the lights cut down?
I think it'd be, well, I don't know.
Hey, the lights. Who's on Stone Mountain Carving?
Okay.
Stone Mountain Carving.
That's what you guys see over there?
Yeah. Okay, what you're seeing here is Ben Fortson, who was Secretary of State for 4 decades. He was at the symbolic last meeting held on Robert E. Lee's shoulder in March of 1970. So that's what this whole loop of photos is about. This is the catwalk that after you come up the elevator 400 feet, you have to cross the catwalk. And then, in order to get down on this platform, you have to come down the ladder. Now, Mr. Fortson could not come down the ladder, so Daddy built a special case for him to be lowered down onto the platform. And of course, there were other dignitaries that said, can I go too? So, there's a lot of them that didn't want to go down that ladder because it was scary. So all this particular, that's Daddy in the white shirt, by the way. These are some of the Stone Mountain Memorial Association dignitaries out there. And the media was there, and Ben Fortson, the secretary to the general manager of the park, and human resources. So it was a day that they were reiterating from back in Augustus Lukeman's time in 1928, from 25 to 28, when he was the second carver on Stone Mountain. The first carver was Borglum, who is credited with carving Mount Rushmore. So he fled Georgia and went to Mount Rushmore. So that's Daddy in the white shirt. So when Lukeman had his symbolic last meeting and he revealed the portion of Robert E. Lee's head that he had completed at that time, he had a similar luncheon on Robert E. Lee's shoulder like this. So this is one they call it a symbolic last meeting. Mary Payne here, she was the secretary to the general manager. They call her eating some fried chicken. That's Daddy in the white shirt. And Ben Fortson at the head of the table. If it wasn't for Ben Fortson, Daddy would not have been the carver of Stone Mountain. Daddy was hired to build the steel structure that the elevator goes up on, the shaft. Because he was a steeplejack, he was a tool and die maker, he was a welder. So he had all the skills to make that happen. And just as we were talking about Potts' store, Daddy had met a gentleman, George Wadlin, and most of the men would gather around that store, get their coffee and their gas and cigarettes and go on to work. Well, George Wadlin had a summer home on Jackson Lake at that time. And so they got to meet each other, know each other, and find out what each other did. So when the mountain was purchased by the state of Georgia and they resumed the carving, that's when George Wadlin had to start looking for carvers to start up the carving after the mountain lay dormant for 38 years. So that's how Daddy got involved. And then when Debbie finished, doing the steel structure for the elevator and everything, the other carvers were having difficulty. They couldn't stand back, they couldn't look at their work and figure out what was wrong. Some of them started getting scared, and a lot of them were making mistakes. So Daddy, not being a carver or a sculptor, he saw many things that they didn't see. So he pointed it out to George Wablin, and George Wablin gave him permission to go on down to Secretary of State and talk to Ben Forson. Ben Forson said, okay, I know you're not a carver, you're not a sculptor, we'll let you work on the side. And from that day on, Daddy became a carver. It's like nobody else wanted to do it. So that's how he really got involved. And I'm going to go into a little bit of his past in just a minute. This on the back of the book. I think we've gone all the way through these. Have we seen them twice yet?
No.
No. Okay, well this is the cage that Daddy built for Ben Fortson. And now you can see the ladder. See how they had to come down the ladder from the sky?
One slip.
It's over 400 feet and it's open face. so
Yeah.
Can you imagine?
See the elevator over there, so they had to walk the catwalk all the way down and then go down the ladder to the scaffolding. So now we've gone through that.
Right.
2014, I started contacting this company called Zulon. And I heard their advertisement on 104.7, the Fish radio station. And it was talking about, if you want to write a book and you want to publish a book. And I said, I don't know anything about doing any of that, but it was interesting. So the more I thought about it, it brought me back to the days when Ron and I were living in our home in Snellville, Georgia. Anybody know where Snellville, Georgia is? Okay, so we were living there. And back in the old days when we used to have the dial-up internet,
Go ahead.
and we had the perforated paper for our printer. Well, back in 2001, I would say it was, I got on my machine and I just typed out a paragraph. And I called it The Man Who Carved Stone Mountain. I didn't know that almost 14 years later, I would be part of this book. I just didn't know that. So anyway, I put that aside and I still have that. I printed it out and I still have it. So back in the days when we lived in Covington, and here's Jack, right?
Yeah.
Is it Jack?
You're John back.
John. Well, we both lived in Covington, not exactly, well, I guess kind of the same time. I moved there in, let's see, 57, 58, because, yeah, I think that's about right, yeah. So we moved there then, and from that point on, I started, meeting other people in that area, and I didn't know you back then. But we lived at the end of a dirt road, which was a mile off of Highway 36. And Kay Jones lived at the front of the dirt road. And her dad was an alcoholic, so she always came to our home and hung out. So every time she saw Daddy, she was asking questions like, aren't you afraid of going up on that mountain? Did you ever fall? Why did you do that? I mean, what makes you think you can do it? What do you do up? Questions little kids ask. Well, who would have thought that in 2014, she and I would find each other on Facebook? She lives in North Carolina. I'm in Georgia. Well, she was born in Georgia. And we found each other, we reminded each other of our childhood, and she started saying, remember when I used to follow your dad around, da, 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 da? I said, yeah. I said, you know what? You said one day that there's gonna be a book written about him, and we agreed on that. And the next thing I know, here she is, packing her bags, coming down to stay with her sister, and for a whole weekend, we would start compiling data. And 5 years in September is how this book will be. So we're so proud that we got a chance to put it together. This is Daddy's memoirs, a biography really on how he became the carver of Stone Mountain. But I'll tell you a little bit about his history that led up to that. Daddy was a country boy born in a small town named Porterdale, just southeast of Atlanta, a man with a purpose. How does someone rise up from barely completing high school, take on such a monumental task, such as etching out 3 historical figures from the Civil War? Well, I'll tell you how. A man that went above and beyond the vision that God gave him to work day and night, and sometimes 7 days a week until the job was finished. My dad was a man who had been dedicated to everything he came in contact, from helping his mother around the house, as well as enlisting into the Marine Corps to help his mother with financial support, and then soon marrying my mom to start his own family. He knew that day on Jefferson Street when he was playing football and the ball struck my mother's ankle that she would soon one day be his wife and the mother of his children. Daddy loved the ocean so much that once a year in August he would take us on a family vacation to Daytona Beach. Other trips he would go to Panama City to enjoy his favorite pastime, which was deep sea fishing. He was so determined that he would never leave his boat until he was satisfied with his catch. A young man with many jobs, starting out as a newspaper boy and moving on to a position as a welder, never dreamed that one day he would be hired as the man to erect an outside 400-foot elevator that would ascend up the side of Stone Mountain. This man who fell in love with the mountain and became the chief carver of the Confederate memorial is the same simple man that never took an art lesson in his life and believed that he had a purpose, which soon became a historical monument that we all have come to love and enjoy. So he was a simple man, but he never sculpted anything, he never carved anything before or after this. The only thing he did is the water tank and Stone Mountain needed painting. And since he was a steeplejack, he had no problems with heights. They gave him a job. So he started doing that. So now I'm going to take you over to some video footage of when Daddy worked on the mountain. If you'll get a chance to hear him talk. I'm the soldier of Confederacy. He decided according was the best way to show homage. From 1909 on, the first officer was doing a large survey of the mountain of Headway. Then, in 1963, Walter Hancock took over the project and hired Marine veteran Roy Faulkner as foreman. The deal was sealed with a handshake. The city headed that 8 years, 5 months, and 19 days later will conquer the mountain and bring the project to completion. See? On an 8-foot-long jet torch utilizing kerosene, oxygen, and water. Sealing the surface of the mountain, the heat of the torch transformed moisture in the rock to the steam, causing the rock to expand and slip away in a flurry of chips and pieces. This condition sped up the process and allowed Roy to shave away the granite like an artist with a paintbrush. Working at jet drilling of 50 miles per hour on a sculpture 825 feet tall and a rock over 300 million years old, Roy continued the vision design in 1909.
weather wasn't a big document. The greatest danger was falling. Roy thought two co-workers fall to death. Roy was the only man to fall and survive. Checking neighboring houses kept him from crashing with the rock below. But Roy was driven by something even bigger than the mountain. In May 1970, the monument was complete. Roy's 3,140 days of work was honored and admired by all. Today, you can meet Roy and see his mountain memorabilia at the Stone Mountain Museum in Royal Lodge.
Wow.
Did you hear that? I mean,
Yeah.
you couldn't? Yeah. This speaker, I tested it, I don't know why it didn't.
That'll be all right. We can pump up that sound. It'll be good fun.
You know, technology's always
Yeah.
thorn in our side.
Then you put on a PA system.
You got his feet.
Or as secure as your kitchen floor. So, he yelled out to the guy, he says, "Is it secure, everything I go?" And the guy said, "Yeah." So Daddy started walking out. Now take in consideration, he's walking away from the mountain, so he's walking out in midair. He's walking from Stonewall Jackson, and he steps on the board, and it slides out from under his foot. So here he is coming down through Little Sorrel's Range down to the rump of Traveler. 10, 15, 20, almost 30 feet. And in midair, he found his body just twirling around because the hose that feed into the torch, and I'll get to that in a minute, they were from the top of the mountain. That's where the oxygen, kerosene, and oxygen tanks were. And they fed the lines down to the carving site. And those were right by his hands when he fell. And he caught it, and he went up and down like a bungee and a yo-yo until he stopped. And then he used his Marine basic skills and climbed right back up. Well, I'm sure the guy up there thought Daddy was a goner and knew that it was all over with and what did he do wrong and so forth. Well, Daddy climbed back up, and he went over to him and he said a few choice words and slapped him and told him to get the number out. So he fired him on the spot. But now, there was a man that also fell to his death, Howard Williams. And then when the carving was finished and Daddy was dedicated with all his hours in May of 1970, that following November of 71, Nelson Wilburn, who was a 24-year-old gentleman with a wife and a child, and his wife was pregnant, he was working on the carving with Daddy, and they were dismantling all of the cables and the scaffolding because the carving was basically complete. So he fell. He just lost his footing and fell off the mountain, and Daddy jumped in the elevator, and it's going down, but it's not going down fast enough. Before it gets almost to the ground, maybe 30 feet before it gets there, he's leaping out of the cage and running over to see if there's any remote possibility that Nelson is alive. Of course he isn't. Not like Daddy. Nelson hit everything going down, whereas Daddy, was facing away from the carving, so he only had air when he was falling. So that was a God-given purpose for Daddy to finish that carving. And that's why I love sharing his legacy, because if it was meant for him to die, he would have died. If it was meant for him to finish his carving, he lived. So only God knows our destiny. So, he left that day, and you remember where Red Oak Methodist Church? Okay. We worshiped there. Daddy wasn't much of a church goer, but we worshiped there. And he drove there after that day, and he sat on the pew, and he cried out to God, and he said, it must have been you, because there's no one else that could have been there to help me on that day. And so when he got his composure, he went on and drove on home, which was another 10 or 15 minutes from there. And Mother never knew he fell. Never knew he fell. He didn't share. He was a quiet man. He was a humble man. And like you heard in the video, I'm just a simple man. You know, just a regular old guy. So I think that we all have a destiny and a purpose, and it is always my privilege to come out and speak to UDC, SCB people, and historical societies, anybody who wants to know about carving, because I'm proud of my dad, as you can tell. And we decided to share his legacy through this book. When this book came to the house, oh my gosh. You never seen somebody cry so hard in your life. He just bawled. And I got him on videotape.
Oh, your dad saw that one?
Yeah.
Wow, that
Yeah.
was
He
good.
lived a year after this book came out in 2015.
Wow.
We did book signings. Matter of fact, the UDC acknowledged Daddy at the Stone Mountain Inn. It was the Georgia Division. At that time, Judy Womack was the president of the Georgia Division. And she came and they honored him with all kinds of certificates and award the Korean Medal and the Jefferson Davis Medal, and he went home with all kinds of medals on him that day. He had never been around so many women in his life. He never had so many kisses and hugs and handshakes in his life. But what an honor it was for them to recognize him on that day.
Who financed this? Who financed it?
The carving?
Yeah, like paying your dad and,
The state of
oh,
Georgia.
they did it? Oh.
Yeah, because see, back in 1909, Helen Plain had the vision of honoring the Civil War leaders and paying homage to them by having a carving of Robert E. Lee on the north face of the mountain.
Yeah.
So at that time, the Venable family owned the mountain. So they deeded the north face of the mountain, I think for like 12 years, I'm not exactly sure, but about 12 years. And when those 12 years were up and the carving wasn't complete, then the amount had to be returned to the Venable family, and the carving stopped. So you had Borglum, you had Lukeman, and then the carving stopped for 38 years until the state of Georgia purchased it, and then the Stone Mountain Memorial Association was formed, and then the sculptors were hired back on, and George Whiteland resumed as the superintendent of the job.
Is that on the list for removal?
Let's hope it don't happen.
Well, I know, I'm just saying, but I have never heard
It's gonna
anything.
be a real undertaking to get rid of that. I hope they don't mess with it.
Well, one airplane with a bomb will do that. I mean, you know, you
Yeah,
say
you're
it's,
gonna destroy that whole mountain, we'll just